We would like to send out a special thanks to Best Fiends for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Best Fiends is a unique and exciting puzzle experience unlike other puzzle games out there. Best Fiends updates the game monthly with new levels and events, so it never gets old. You can download it free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. Thank you, and enjoy the show. February 26th, 1980. Berkeley, California. 51-year-old Al Mills, his 40-year-old wife Jeannie, and Jeannie's 16-year-old daughter Daphene are all shot to death execution-style inside their home. Jeannie's 17-year-old son Eddie is left unharmed inside his bedroom, but claims he did not hear the murders take place. Since the Mills family had defected from Jim Jones's cult, the People's Temple, and become outspoken advocates against them, there is speculation that surviving members of the group orchestrated their assassination. However, investigators suspect Eddie of being the perpetrator, and while they make a failed attempt to charge him with the crime 25 years later, the Mills family murders are never solved. After that, the trail went cold.
Mr. Mills, you were in that church. You've heard some of the things that we've discussed just as outsiders. Tell us what your views are.
Well, I think any politician, after reading the New West article and after hearing the other subsequent articles that came out in the Examiner, to continue to unquestionably be involved with Jim Jones is blind. I think you, Mr. Goodlett, still haven't reconciled the fact that Jim Jones cared nothing for you but what he could get out of you. Jim Jones used every politician. He had no respect for anyone. I took a photograph of him hugging, I can't remember the man's name, a black associate mayor. Jim Jones had his finger up like this. Jim Jones, my loyalty, I showed Jim Jones this picture. It was a big joke. He cares for no one but Jim Jones. I have no hostilities towards People's Temple. I'm very concerned about the people down there that are still alive. I'm sorry that we were unable to free these people from the prison camp before this happened. If we could have had people like you, like all the other politicians, that really listened to the first light that maybe something was wrong and started examining, maybe we could have stopped this before it happened.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got a very interesting cold case to cover today. The 1980 murders of the Mills family. This story involves the fatal shootings of a couple and their teenage daughter, but what's truly unique is that this could almost be considered an epilogue to one of the most infamous tragedies of all time. That sound clip you just heard was from a TV news segment on KQED in San Francisco, which aired on November the 20th, 1978, just 2 days removed from the Jonestown Massacre. And the individual you heard speaking was Al Mills, who would end up becoming the victim of a brutal murder alongside his wife Jeannie and stepdaughter Daphene only 15 months later. I'm sure pretty much all of you are familiar with the notorious Reverend Jim Jones, who launched a religious movement/cult called the People's Temple and went down in infamy after orchestrating a mass murder-suicide involving himself and over 900 of his followers at his Jonestown settlement in Guyana. Well, years earlier, Al and Jeannie Mills were high-ranking members of the People's Temple, but they eventually grew very disturbed about Jones's cruel tactics and decided to defect from their group alongside their children. They soon became very outspoken opponents of Jones and his cult, publicly exposing their human rights abuses and launching a support group for other defectors from the organization. Naturally, this put them right at the top of Jones's enemies list, so there was a lot of speculation that Al, Jeannie, and Daphene were murdered by a vengeful hit squad consisting of loyal surviving members of the People's Temple. However, the big complication is that Jeannie's 17-year-old son Eddie was inside his bedroom when the murders took place and left unharmed, and he always maintained that he never heard a thing. The authorities found enough suspicious discrepancies to believe that Eddie murdered his mother, stepfather, and sister himself, but they lacked the evidence to build a successful case against him. Opinions are still sharply divided about whether the Mills family were murdered by outside intruders or if Eddie was the real perpetrator, so we're going to explore both sides on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved murders of the Mills family. Our story begins in Berkeley, California in 1980. Two of our central figures are 51-year-old Al Mills and his 40-year-old wife, Jeannie Mills, who are currently living in a suburban cottage alongside Jeannie's two children from a previous marriage, 17-year-old Eddie and 16-year-old Daphene. At around 9:20 p.m. on the evening of February the 26th, Al's mother, who lived in a nearby rest home, arrived at the Mills' cottage for a visit, but made a horrific discovery when she entered the master bedroom and came across the murdered bodies of Al, Jeannie, and Daphene. After she let out a scream, Eddie suddenly emerged from his bedroom across the hall and joined his grandmother, and the Berkeley Police Department were immediately contacted and summoned to the scene. It turned out that all three victims had been the victim of an execution-style shooting with a .22 caliber weapon. Al was lying face down on the bedroom floor and had been shot through the back of the head. Jeannie was lying dead on the floor in the adjacent bathroom and was also shot in the back of the head. Daphene was lying on top of the bed with 2 gunshots to her right temple, but she was still alive and rushed to the hospital. She remained in critical condition for the next 2 days, but had suffered such extensive brain damage that she was neurologically dead and had zero hope of recovery. Daphene was kept alive long enough so that one of her kidneys could be used for a transplant before she was taken off life support. Eddie claimed that after taking a long shower, he had gone inside his bedroom to smoke some marijuana and watch television, but maintained that he did not hear any gunshots and had no idea a crime had even taken place until he heard his grandmother screaming. When the Mills' neighbors and other local residents were interviewed by police, they also claimed that they did not hear gunshots or anything unusual. 2 family friends had visited the residence at around 5 p.m. and said that everything seemed normal and that the atmosphere was friendly. There were no signs of forced entry or any struggle at the cottage, but one neighbor said it was not uncommon for the Millses to leave their front door unlocked so that their children's friends could enter and exit the house with ease. Since nothing appeared to have been stolen from the residence, robbery was ruled out as a possible motive for the murders, but rumors immediately started circulating that the crime may have been a professional hit, since the Mills family had an extraordinary backstory. Before they were known as Al and Jeannie Mills, the couple used to go by their real names, Elmer and Deanna Myrtle. When they first met, Elmer and Deanna had already been through previous marriages and had a total of 5 children between them. Deanna had Eddie and Daphene, while Elmer had 3 children named Steve, Linda, and Diana. They officially got married to each other in 1968, but within a year, Elmer would quit his job at Standard Oil so that he and Deanna and their 5 children could join the People's Temple, a new religious movement founded by the Reverend Jim Jones, which was situated in California's Redwood Valley at that time. As most of you probably know, it would turn out that the People's Temple functioned like a cult, as its members would be brainwashed by the Reverend Jones, who forced them to turn over all their property, possessions, and assets, and swear their undying loyalty to him. According to Deanna, when Eddie was only 8 years old, she believed that he had developed an irregular heartbeat. While Eddie was never diagnosed by a doctor, Jones performed telepathy on him and convinced Deanna that he had miraculously cured his condition, which played a key role in her family's decision to devote their entire lives to Jones and the People's Temple. The Myrtles became key players in the organization, as Deanna served as head of their publications office, while Elmer functioned as the official photographer, and they were both members of the group's governing council, known as the Planning Commission. However, as the years went on, the Myrtles gradually became disillusioned with the People's Temple, particularly after witnessing Jones perform numerous acts of cruelty, such as frequent beatings of his followers, including the children. The breaking point occurred in 1974, when the Myrtles witnessed Jones use a 2-foot-long paddle to spank Elmer's daughter Linda, who was 16 at the time. According to Jones, Linda had embraced a friend of hers whom he considered to be a quote-unquote traitor, and spanked her with the paddle 75 times as punishment. After spending the next year working up their courage to leave, the Myrtles finally decided to defect from the People's Temple with their children. When they originally joined the group, Elmer and Deanna were forced to turn all their properties over to Jones and granted him full power of attorney. To prove their loyalty, Jones also demanded that his members sign false confessions to committing such horrific crimes as molesting their own children, which he could use against them if they ever decided to leave. In order to void all the powers Jones had over them, Elmer and Deanna Myrtle officially changed their names to Al and Jeannie Mills. After the Mills family moved to Berkeley, Al and Jeannie became outspoken opponents of the People's Temple and wanted to help others who followed their example and defected from the cult. The couple established the Human Freedom Center, a halfway house which functioned as a sanctuary for defectors and refugees who had nowhere else to go. The Millses also worked alongside another defector named Timothy Stone, a former People's Temple attorney who had once served as Jones's right-hand man, and together they formed their own organization called the Concerned Relatives of People's Temple Members. It served as a support group for defectors and their families and sought to deprogram them and help them readjust to normal society again. In July of 1977, New West magazine published an expose about Jones and his organization titled Inside People's Temple, in which the Millses and other former members exposed the cruelty and human rights abuses which took place there. They continued to exert pressure on the media and the government to take action against Jones and his group. Needless to say, Jones was outraged by the Millses' actions and would reportedly deliver angry rants to his followers in which he referred to the Millses as traitors and vowed to get revenge on them. During this time period, the Millses claimed they received a number of threatening phone calls and found threatening notes on their doorstep. At one point, a bomb went off inside the bank where the Millses kept a safety deposit box, and they soon found a note on the front porch in which the People's Temple took credit for the incident. On one occasion, Al's daughter Diana reported seeing 8 or 9 armed men in the yard of their home. The concerned relatives of People's Temple members eventually helped convince Leo Ryan, a Democratic congressman from San Mateo, to perform an investigation into the organization and their practices. By this point, Jones had already established the People's Temple Agricultural Project, aka Jonestown, a remote settlement in the jungles of Guyana, which was the primary base of operations for Jones and his followers. Ryan and his delegation, which included his staff, some media representatives, and several relatives of People's Temple members, decided to travel to Jonestown on a fact-finding mission, but a devastating tragedy would soon take place. On November the 18th, 1978, after Ryan and his entourage visited Jonestown, they left the settlement with a group of People's Temple members who expressed their desire to defect and traveled to an airstrip in Port Katuma in order to board a pair of transport planes to leave. It wasn't long before some People's Temple gunmen opened fire on the group, killing 5 people, including Ryan, and wounding 9 others. And unfortunately, it wasn't long before Jones orchestrated a mass murder-suicide at Jonestown, in which his followers were forced to drink Flavor Aid laced with potassium cyanide. 4 followers died at the People's Temple headquarters in Guyana's capital city of Georgetown, while 909 of them died at Jonestown, and the whole incident would become known as the Jonestown Massacre. Jones elected to end his own life by shooting himself in the head, but before he did so, he recorded a final 44-minute piece of audio which became known as the death tape. At one point, he specifically made mention of Deanna Myrtle, now known as Jeannie Mills by this point, blaming her and Timothy Stone for causing the whole situation. He seemed to imply that surviving members of the People's Temple, who were still at their former headquarters in San Francisco, would get revenge, stating, quote, "The people in San Francisco will not be idle. They'll not take our death in vain, you know," end quote. Needless to say, once word about what happened in Jonestown reached Berkeley, the Mills family, along with other former members of the People's Temple and their families, were placed under police protection. For a while, there was fear of potential retribution from Jones's most loyal People's Temple survivors, and there were rumors that a quote-unquote hit list had been circulated among the organization's remaining followers, with instructions to kill as many people on the list as possible. The FBI and the San Francisco Police Department would perform an intelligence detail to look into the possible existence of People's Temple hit squads, but never found any evidence to corroborate these rumors, and ultimately came to the conclusion that these so-called hit squads did not actually exist and were nothing more than an urban legend. In 1979, Jeannie published a memoir about her experiences titled 6 Years with God, Life Inside Jim Jones's People's Temple. Both her and Al would tour the lecture circuit in order to share their story and continue their work assisting People's Temple defectors. But by early 1980, Jeannie seemed ready to move on with her life, and only a few weeks before her death, she made this statement before a gathering of students. Quote, "I've pretty much put all that behind me now. I'm tired of being an ex-member of the People's Temple. I really want to get on with the business of living." End quote. Of course, once Al, Jeannie, and Daphene were shot to death, rumors started circulating again about them being the victims of an assassination from a People's Temple hit squad. By this point, Al's children from his previous marriage were no longer living at the family's residence in Berkeley, but at around 9:30 p.m. on the night of the murders, his daughter Linda, who was living in the Bay Area, claimed that she received an odd phone call at her home from an anonymous female who told her, quote, "Al and Jeannie are dead. If I were you, I would lock the door." There would also be an eyewitness account from an 18-year-old former boyfriend of Daphene's, who said that he was walking past the Mills residence sometime between 8:45 and 9 p.m. and saw 3 young men exiting the home. They then climbed into a Pontiac Grand Am driven by a 4th man before speeding away. Police apparently did not find this young man's account to be credible, since he had a history of run-ins with the law, but when they gave him a lie detector test, he did wind up passing. However, this would turn out to be the only sighting of potential intruders at the cottage that night. Investigators would uncover an odd piece of evidence when they noticed that the Millses had attached a tape recorder to a telephone answering device which would automatically record all of their calls. They soon found a cassette containing an old phone conversation between Daphene and one of her friends, where Daphene was asked when she was going to get the house, and she replied, quote, "I guess when I kill my parents." However, since Daphene was shot twice in the head, and there was no gun found at the scene, investigators discounted the possibility of the crime being a murder-suicide. By this point, most of the suspicion was directed towards the only surviving member of the household, Eddie, who continued to maintain that he had been inside his bedroom when his family was murdered and did not hear a thing. Eddie was given a GSR, aka gunshot residue test, which turned up microscopic traces of gunshot residue on his right hand. A criminologist pushed forward the theory that Eddie could have washed or wiped his hand after firing a weapon, which would explain why there was such a small amount of GCR remaining. A Berkeley police spokesman would address this issue by stating, quote, "There was some trace of gunpowder on his hands, but it was such a small amount that it conceivably could have been come by innocently. The key word here is conceivably. Eddie Mills is not a suspect in the case, in the sense that we are actively focusing on him, but he has not been eliminated, and that is significant. A number of doubts we have not been cleared up." End quote. Even though Eddie was a high school dropout, and had gone through issues with adjusting to a normal life after spending his childhood with the People's Temple, he was described as a quiet, non-violent person who was currently helping his stepfather remodel old homes as student rentals and showed no signs of being capable of murdering his family. The biggest obstacle in the police's investigation was that they could not find the murder weapon, and even after searching through the properties of about a dozen homes located near the Mills residence, they came up empty. The Berkeley PD even received a Department of Justice list of all small gun purchases which had taken place in the Bay Area in the 6 months prior to the murders, but after interviewing each person who bought one, they still hit a dead end. Eddie hired an attorney who advised him not to take a lie detector test, and he would move to Oakland to live with his half-brother, Steve. Jeannie and Al left behind an estate which included 13 properties and was worth over $700,000, and in 1983, it would be dispersed among their surviving relatives. Since Eddie was technically Jeannie's only surviving heir, he wound up collecting the largest portion of the estate and received around $210,000. The investigation into the murders would reach a standstill, though the Alameda County District Attorney's Office would describe all of the surviving Mills family members as being uncooperative. In 2003, the Berkeley Police Department decided to reopen the investigation into the Mills murders, which would be led by Russ Lopes, a retired lieutenant who was specifically brought in to re-examine unsolved cold cases. By this point, Eddie was living in Japan with a wife and 2 children, but was still the focus of the investigation. His surviving relatives were re-interviewed and asked to turn over any additional evidence they might have had that Eddie was responsible for the crime, but most of them believed he was innocent and that there was no evidence to give. On December the 3rd, 2005, Eddie, who was now 43 years old, decided to make his first trip to the United States in several years in order to visit family members for the holidays. But once his flight landed at San Francisco International Airport, Eddie was detained by customs officials, and he would soon be arrested on 3 counts of murder and taken to the Berkeley City Jail. Russ Lopes had spent the past 2 years putting together a case against Eddie and submitted it to the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. If Eddie was charged, he would be prosecuted as a juvenile since he was only 17 years old when the crime took place. However, he could only be held for a maximum of 48 hours, while the District Attorney's Office decided whether or not to charge him. In the end, they felt there were still some questions about the evidence, and that 48 hours was an inadequate amount of time to perform a thorough review, so they ultimately declined to file charges. Eddie was released from custody and soon returned to Japan, where he continues to live with his wife and children to this day. While Russ Lopes did not hesitate to express his belief that Eddie was guilty of the murders, Eddie's half-sister Linda publicly showed her support. She did not think that Eddie was the perpetrator and openly criticized the police, stating, quote, "They don't want to do the footwork to find out who really did this," end quote. So after 4 decades, the Mills family murders continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Best Fiends. True crime is my biggest passion, and one of the best things about it is that the further you dig into a story, the more layers you uncover. That's particularly true about the stories featured on this podcast, as we exclusively cover unsolved cold cases which are often massive jigsaw puzzles, and the second half of each episode involves an attempt to put the pieces of the puzzle together and figure out what might have happened. Well, that's part of what I love about the puzzle game Best Fiends. Reaching each new level feels like uncovering a new layer in a story, one you get to take part in. And the best part is the longer you play Best Fiends, the more fun and exciting it gets. Best Fiends also updates the game monthly with new levels and events, so it never gets old. I've been playing it for several months now, and the last time you heard from me, I had just reached the milestone of hitting level 500, and I'm pleased to say that I've now passed level 520. In addition to the challenging puzzles, Best Fiends also has a vibrant visual design with bright colors to keep you engaged, and no matter whether you're competitive or just like to play for fun, this is a casual game that anyone can play. Best Fiends has thousands of levels already, with new levels, events, and characters added every month. It's hours of fun right at your fingertips, and you can even play offline. With over 100 million downloads and tons of 5-star reviews, Best Fiends is a must-play. So download Best Fiends free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. Anyway, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the story of the People's Temple and the Jonestown Massacre. I elected not to go into too much detail about it on this episode because it has already been so well documented, and there are other true crime podcasts, like Casefile, who have already provided a thorough accounting of this story. But I do have a major fascination with unsolved mysteries that have a connection to famous events like this. You might recall the episode I did over 2 years ago about the unexplained death of Ronald Hughes, who was Leslie Van Houten's defense attorney during the Manson family's murder trial. The saga of the Manson family has been covered to death, but one of their attorneys going missing during a camping trip in the middle of their trial and turning up dead under suspicious circumstances is a very compelling side story. However, even though I do not believe the Manson family murdered Ronald Hughes, as his death was likely nothing more than a tragic accident caused by a flash flood, there very clearly was foul play in the Mills family case, though whether their murders actually had anything to do with the People's Temple is another story. Even though Jim Jones and most of his followers had already been dead for 15 months by this point, did the People's Temple still have enough leftover survivors who would have been loyal enough to get revenge by murdering the Millses? Now, I have to admit that when I first became familiar with this case many years ago, I initially believed that there was only one possible explanation for what happened here. Generally, when an entire family is murdered inside their home, and there is one survivor who is left completely unharmed, you have to be suspicious. I have seen home invasion murder cases in which several victims were killed, and the lone survivor decided to stage the scene by inflicting a wound on themselves to make it look like they were attacked by outside intruders. But here we have Eddie Mills, who not only was completely unharmed, but claimed that he was in his bedroom directly across the hall and did not hear anything. And not only that, there were traces of gunshot residue on his hands. On the surface, that seems pretty damning, but the more I thought about this case, the more I realized that it wasn't nearly as cut and dried as I thought. I mean, this was a pretty brutal crime, and if you believe Eddie did it, you also have to believe that a 17-year-old performed an execution-style shooting of his mother, stepfather, and sister, and did such a successful job of getting rid of the murder weapon that no one has ever found it after 40 years. As far as I know, the only evidence against Eddie which has been released publicly is the gunshot residue on his hands. When a case was submitted to the district attorney's office to charge Eddie with the murders in 2005, it's unclear what, if any, new evidence they managed to uncover which compelled them to charge Eddie after all these years. There's also a question of motive, but you have to consider the fact that Eddie had an abnormal childhood, to say the least. He was raised in an environment where children were often subject to beatings and psychological torture, such as sleep deprivation, and even though his family managed to escape the People's Temple, it sounds like both Eddie and his sister had issues readjusting to normal society. But could the whole experience have messed up Eddie so much that it drove him to murder his family before he even reached adulthood? Well, before we talk more about Eddie, we have to discuss the victims. Like I mentioned in the intro, that sound clip that I played of Al Mills at the beginning of this episode was from a news segment that aired only 2 days after the Jonestown Massacre, and you can tell that Al was completely shaken up by the whole thing. The individual he was speaking to in that clip was Carlton Goodlett, a civil rights activist who had worked as Jim Jones' personal physician, and Al is distressed by the fact that Goodlett is almost acting as an apologist for Jones, even though he has now been proven to be responsible for the deaths of over 900 people. The Millses had played a role in convincing Congressman Leo Ryan to pay a visit to Jonestown, which is what ultimately led to Jones' decision to orchestrate a mass murder-suicide. Given the circumstances, even if Ryan had not made that trip, I think there's a good chance the whole tragedy was inevitable, and that Jones still would have done the same thing at another point in the future, but I'm sure this still must have been a heavy burden for the Millses to bear. At the time that interview was recorded, it's unclear if Al had found out yet that Jones specifically mentioned his wife on his final death tape and implied that his followers would seek revenge, but the Millses were genuinely concerned that surviving members of the People's Temple would come after them. Even though Al and Jeannie both played prominent roles in their public crusade against the People's Temple, I'd say that Jeannie was the more high-profile figure, especially when she published her memoir, 6 Years with God, 1 year later. If you go on YouTube, you'll also find a fascinating documentary titled Deceived, the Jonestown Tragedy, which was filmed in 1979 and features interviews with Al, Jeannie, and Daphene. It's quite chilling to see the three of them talk about their experiences in the People's Temple and how they managed to escape, knowing that they would all be brutally murdered less than 1 year later. I won't delve too much into this, but it's quite fascinating to read accounts from former People's Temple members who managed to defect from the cult and were successfully deprogrammed once they met the Millses and stayed at their Human Freedom Center. There's one particularly interesting article from a survivor named Neva Sly Hargrave who had become drawn to Jim Jones after witnessing heal a blind woman in a wheelchair so that she was able to see and walk again. Well, when Hargrave went to the Human Freedom Center, Jeannie put her in touch with the woman who had been in the wheelchair, who was another People's Temple defector, and she revealed that the whole scene had been faked, which helped convince Hargrave that everything about Jones and his cult were a lie. But while Jeannie undoubtedly helped a number of people and did a lot of good with her work, it must be said that her methods did make her some enemies as well. In an article published in the March 9, 1981 edition of the San Francisco Examiner, Lowell Stryker, a psychologist who had worked with the Millses at the Human Freedom Center, stated, quote, "When our relationship was good, it was very, very good, and when it was bad, it was horrid," end quote. Indeed, Stryker could see similarities between how Jeannie operated the Human Freedom Center and how Jim Jones operated the People's Temple, and stated, quote, "When Jeannie saw I could no longer be used to help her achieve her ambitions, which were fame, riches, and personal recognition, she turned against me, which unfortunately was a pattern she had with many people. She would meet a person, trust him, invite him to trust her, work with him to achieve a goal, then feel he didn't understand the goal, then turn and almost crusade against him. It was a very socially productive pattern when the target was Jim Jones, but when it was a personal friend like myself or others, it was another matter. She brought terrible habits with her from the temple: vindictiveness, paranoia, and secretiveness, backstabbing, basically cult games," end quote. It's also worth noting that during his time at the Human Freedom Center, Stryker said he often saw Eddie hanging out there, watching his portable television, and this is how he described him, quote, "He was totally withdrawn, but not sullen or angry, just quiet and polite. The kid I saw was not capable of killing his parents," end quote. Now, I'm not sure if Stryker's comments have any relevance at all to the actual murders, but it brings up an intriguing possibility, which I'll talk about momentarily. The one thing which seems clear about this crime is that it was a personal one, as nothing was stolen from the house, so whoever did it, their only goal was to murder one or more members of the family. The most common theory which was floated around during that time period was that the Millses were victims of a hit squad consisting of surviving members of the People's Temple. Investigators never found any evidence that these hit squads actually existed, and if they did, well, then this probably would have been their only crime. If you search online, you'll find a list of suspicious deaths which conspiracy theorists believe are possibly linked to the People's Temple, and the Mills family murders are included on them. But the important thing to note is that all of the other deaths took place before the Jonestown Massacre. There don't seem to be any other suspicious deaths which took place after Jonestown that have a tangible link to the People's Temple, so this doesn't sound like a particularly efficient hit squad. The way they were portrayed, these People's Temple assassins were supposedly on a suicide mission, as they would have no other purpose in life besides killing as many of their enemies as possible before they were stopped. Yet the only people on the Temple's so-called hit list who wound up dead were the Millses, and they were not killed until a full 15 months after the Jonestown Massacre. I think it's safe to say that the People's Temple hit squad was nothing more than a myth, though of course, this doesn't rule out the possibility of the crime being committed by someone who had a connection to the cult. That's why I brought up that interview with Lowell Stryker, because it opens up an interesting alternate theory. What if the perpetrator was someone whom Jeannie had worked with in the past, but had a major falling out with? As a hypothetical example, let's say this person was a former People's Temple member who joined the Human Freedom Center, but then their relationship with Jeannie turned bad and they felt alienated by her. In response, they decided to invade the Mills' residence and commit these murders. Of course, that's all pure speculation, because as far as I can tell, the investigation never turned up any promising suspects besides Eddie. But the point is that by 1980, both Jeannie and her husband had become recognizable figures after sharing their story about their experiences with the People's Temple, so there's no shortage of people who might have had a motive to kill them, and they didn't necessarily have to be assassins from a hit squad. One alternate theory which has been presented is that the original target was actually Timothy Stone, as Jones also mentioned his name on his infamous death tape when he implied that his surviving followers were going to seek revenge. Long story short, even though Stone had once been Jones's right-hand man, the relationship fell apart when Stone's infant son John was born, and Stone signed an affidavit where he stated that Jones was the child's biological father. This began a lengthy custody battle between Stone and Jones, which lasted several years, and tragically, John wound up being poisoned during the Jonestown Massacre at the age of 6. Stone became such an outspoken opponent against the People's Temple that he combined with the Millses to form the Concerned Relatives of People's Temple members. Jones reportedly felt so betrayed by Stone's defection that he ordered his followers to write detailed fantasies about murdering him. Anyway, Stone had lived with the Millses at their cottage in Berkeley for a time, which is why it's been theorized that perhaps Stone was the intended target and the perpetrator mistakenly believed he was still living there. However, I think this theory is completely undermined by the fact that Eddie was left unharmed. If the killer entered the residence with the express purpose of murdering Stone, you'd think they would have checked every room to look for him. If Eddie is telling the truth about being inside his bedroom the entire time, then it makes zero sense that the intruder would murder his family across the hall, but not bother to enter Eddie's bedroom to see if Stone was there. Though it seems pretty cut and dried that Al, Jeannie, or perhaps even Daphene were the intended targets, because after they were killed in the master bedroom, the shooter didn't seem concerned about anything else. Another big unanswered question is whether Daphene just happened to be in her parents' bedroom when she was shot, or did she hear the shots and come running in there? Or did the perpetrator find Daphene in her own room and bring her into the master bedroom before shooting all 3 of the victims? Again, if that's what happened, it's very odd that they wouldn't even bothered to check Eddie's room. However, if Al, Jeannie, or both of them were the intended targets, the intruder may not have cared about killing their children, but since Daphene just happened to be in the bedroom at that time, they had to shoot her too because she was a witness. One of the most ironic things about this case is that if you looked into the backgrounds of both Eddie and Daphene, most people who knew the family would have said that Daphene was a much more likely candidate to have committed the crime, as she apparently had a volatile relationship with her parents at times. Like Eddie, Daphene often had problems in school and clearly had difficulties adjusting to a normal life after spending her childhood in the People's Temple. Following the murders, one of Daphene's friends claimed that she had briefly run away from home 2 months earlier and came over to her house crying, where she showed a red mark on her cheek from where she said her stepfather slapped her. I mentioned earlier that police recovered a recording of a phone conversation in which Daphene told a friend that she would get the family's house after she killed her parents, though I get the impression that it was nothing more than a silly, sarcastic comment from a jaded teenager. Even if it wasn't, the evidence clearly shows that this crime was not a murder-suicide. I guess another possible theory is that Daphene could have been the intended target all along, and her mother and stepfather were just collateral damage. I would really like to know more details about this ex-boyfriend of Daphene's, who claimed he saw 3 men running out of the Mills residence on the night of the crime, and fleeing the scene in a Pontiac Grand Am driven by a 4th man. This witness's name has never been released publicly, and he is not mentioned during most accounts of this case, as I only found out about him through some newspaper articles, which were published in the months following the murders. I know police did not consider him to be a credible witness because he had a history of trouble with the law, and while he did pass a polygraph test, after that, I never saw any more mention of him. Unless investigators found compelling evidence to completely discount his story, it's odd that it isn't given more credence, because this is the only eyewitness account which places outside intruders at the Mills residence that night. Of course, if you want a really off-the-wall theory, perhaps this guy committed the murders because he wanted revenge on Daphene for their breakup, and then fabricated the story about the men in the car in order to take the heat off himself. But that's just wild speculation. However, another piece of evidence which supports the intruder theory, and has only gotten mentioned in a handful of newspaper articles, is the claim from Eddie's half-sister Linda that she received an anonymous phone call from someone informing her that Al and Jeannie had been killed. At least one source stated that the call took place at around 9:30 p.m., which is around the same time when police were summoned to the scene, so assuming that Linda is telling the truth, the caller had to have some inside knowledge. And since Linda said the caller was female, this rules out the possibility of it being Eddie. So who was this woman, and how did she know about the murders? It's worth noting that when Eddie was arrested in 2005, Linda publicly expressed her belief that he was innocent, and if she really did receive that anonymous call, then you can understand why Linda would be inclined to feel this way, since it leans towards someone else being the killer. So now we have to talk about Eddie himself, who quite frankly, seems to be a bit of an enigma. At the time of the murders, he had dropped out of high school, but there were no apparent red flags that he was capable of something like this. Of course, Eddie's childhood in the People's Temple would have been difficult enough because of the abuse he was forced to endure, but another thing which must have had a devastating psychological effect was the fact that he grew up alongside a number of other children in the temple who were friends of his, and a lot of them wound up losing their lives during the Jonestown Massacre. That obviously played a role in making Eddie a quiet, withdrawn teenager, but if he displayed any warning signs of being a murderer of his own family, it doesn't sound like anyone ever said anything. We also don't know much about Eddie's life since the crime took place, except that he got married, had 2 children, and eventually moved to Japan. So if Eddie is guilty, he seemed to have no issues moving on with his life after committing an act of familicide. The main evidence against Eddie is that traces of gunshot residue were found on his right hand, but you have to remember that it was a pretty small, microscopic amount. It certainly wasn't enough to charge him with the murders at that time, because if he washed or wiped his hands after firing a gun, that would explain why the amount wasn't bigger. There's been a lot of debate over the years about the reliability of gunshot residue as evidence, as it does not conclusively prove that someone fired a gun. In fact, there's even been one wrongful conviction case in which an innocent man named Sabine Burgess spent nearly 20 years in prison for the murder of his girlfriend, based solely on the presence of gunshot residue on his hands. Well, it turned out this GSR had actually transferred onto his hands while he was cradling his girlfriend's body, so his conviction was overturned after this evidence was proven to be scientifically unsound. While I've never seen any indication that Eddie touched his family's bodies after they were killed, that could provide one potentially innocent explanation for how GSR could have transferred to his hand. This type of transfer can also occur by touching surfaces which have been contaminated by GSR, or even something as simple as shaking hands with another person who fired a gun earlier that day. I'm not saying that's necessarily what happened in this case, But if there's no corroborating evidence to implicate Eddie besides microscopic traces of GSR, then I can understand the reluctance to charge him with this crime. But theoretically, let's say Eddie did this. He would then have to leave the house and dispose of the murder weapon before returning, and he obviously did a pretty thorough job since the police searched about a dozen different properties and never found anything. That's certainly not impossible, but again, we're talking about a 17-year-old kid, not a criminal mastermind. It's also unclear if they also checked Eddie's clothes for gunshot residue. By his own admission, Eddie took a long shower that night, which would have given him an opportunity to clean up potential evidence, and if it turned out he also threw his clothing into the washing machine shortly before the bodies were discovered, then yes, that would look very suspicious. But again, I don't see any indication that his clothing was tested. I've seen a map of the layout of the Mills residence, and it looks like they had 2 bathrooms. The one where Jeannie's body was found was adjacent to the master bedroom, but the second bathroom was in the hallway next to Eddie's room. It's never been specifically stated at what point during the evening Eddie claimed he took a shower. If the murders took place while he was inside the shower, then I actually believe he might not have heard the shots, and if he then went straight to his room without looking through the doorway of the master bedroom, he might not have noticed his family was lying dead inside. However, the intruder would have had to pass the bathroom in order to reach the master bedroom, so would they not have heard the sound of the shower and checked inside there? The same logic applies if Eddie was inside his bedroom watching television while the murders took place. Theoretically, the volume could have been loud enough to drown out the gunshots, but wouldn't the intruder have been able to hear the television from outside and enter the bedroom to check? I did read an article about this case published in a 1992 issue of Psychology Today magazine, which stated that Eddie had also been listening to a stereo in his bedroom with headphones on. If true, this would explain how Eddie could have conceivably not heard the gunshots without making any noise to attract attention, but I have not seen that detail about the headphones mentioned in any other source, not even the dozens of newspaper articles about these murders, so I can't confirm if that particular detail is true. In Eddie's defense, none of the other neighbors or residents in the area reported hearing gunshots that night either. The murder weapon was a .22 caliber pistol, which does make some noise, but I've actually watched some YouTube videos of people putting a suppressor on a .22 before firing it, and it really wasn't all that loud at all. So if an intruder used some sort of silencer when they fired those shots, then it isn't quite as hard to believe that Eddie may not have heard it. While there were no signs of forced entry, the Mills' neighbors confirmed that it wasn't uncommon for them to leave their front door unlocked, so it's not completely implausible that an intruder could have just walked into the house and committed these murders without Eddie noticing. But if Eddie was the perpetrator, his plan was rather odd. After disposing of the murder weapon, he shuts himself inside his bedroom until his grandmother arrives and discovers the bodies. I know that it's not uncommon for killers to deliberately arrange things so that independent eyewitnesses discover their victims' bodies, but did Eddie know beforehand that his grandmother was going to be visiting the cottage at that particular time of night? I mean, what if she had decided to show up while he was outside disposing of the murder weapon? Again, this is an inexperienced kid, not a criminal mastermind, but you'd think that a guilty person would try to concoct a better cover story than, I was directly across the hall in my bedroom while my family was shot, and I didn't hear anything. In terms of potential motive, Eddie did wind up inheriting over $200,000 from his family's estate, though he did not actually receive any of that money until over 3 years later. Now, Al and Jeannie had arranged things so that their estate was divided equally between them, as all of their children were from previous marriages rather than with each other. This meant that when their assets were dispersed, Eddie wound up getting the largest portion, since he was Jeannie's only surviving heir, whereas Al's 3 children had to divide up his portion of the estate, which is why they got smaller amounts. The point is that it's unclear if Eddie would have even been aware of how much money he was entitled to receive following these murders, so I can't be certain if that would have been his primary motive. I guess an alternate possibility is that Eddie could have gotten someone else to kill his family and get rid of the murder weapon when they left. So even if the eyewitness account of the 3 men leaving the house and Linda's story about the anonymous phone call are accurate, that just means there were others involved in the crime, and that Eddie could still be guilty. But then, why would anyone agree to murder Eddie's family on his behalf? As a 17-year-old, it's not like he would have had much money to pay them. So as it stands, we do have a few reasons to be suspicious of Eddie, but not much actionable evidence which could be used to prosecute him in court. Once again, I'm not sure the Berkeley Police Department would have reopened the case and decided to arrest Eddie 25 years after the fact if the only evidence they had was microscopic traces of gunshot residue on his hand. They must have dug up something else to implicate him, but whatever it was, it doesn't sound like it was strong enough for the district attorney's office to charge him. After Eddie was released from custody, it was interesting to read an interview in the San Francisco Chronicle with Russ Lopes, the cold case investigator who built the case against Eddie. Lopes was brought out of retirement by the Berkeley PD to specifically investigate their older cold cases, and he also worked on the unsolved 1970 murder of a Berkeley police officer named Ronald Tsukamoto. Much like the Mills case, Lopes was certain he had figured out who the guilty party was and submitted a case to the Alameda County District Attorney's Office, but once again, they did not feel the evidence was strong enough to file charges. So when the same thing happened with Eddie, Lopes got incredibly frustrated and stated, quote, "Even if you're not absolutely 100% sure you'll win at trial, you take it to trial and let a jury decide. Weaker cases have gone to trial." End quote. Well, the problem is that trials cost time and money, and prosecutors don't like bringing cases to court if they don't have a good chance of winning, especially since you can't try someone a second time if they're found not guilty. Eddie's stepsister, Linda, believed that Lopes had major tunnel vision and refused to consider looking at other suspects, stating, quote, "I think he's power tripping, personally. I think he's taking advantage of his power." End quote. Well, without knowing the full details of the case that Lopes submitted to the DA, I have no idea if Linda's statements are accurate, but I am willing to acknowledge that there may have been tunnel vision from the very beginning, and that since Eddie was the only one who survived the massacre, police refused to believe that anyone else could have been the killer. One of the reasons it's so easy to place all the focus on Eddie is because the investigation has failed to uncover any compelling alternate suspects these past 4 decades. But what if Linda is right, and the police have just refused to consider other suspects, causing them to let the real killer slip through their fingers? You can be skeptical of Eddie's story all you want, but it's not impossible that an outside intruder could have entered the residence and murdered the rest of the family while he was in another room. I hate to say this, but I'm really not sure where I stand on this case. Every time I feel certain that Eddie must have been the perpetrator, I start wondering how he managed to get rid of the murder weapon and pull this off without leaving any more damning evidence behind. I do think that the rumors about a People's Temple hit squad are bunk, but the crime does still have the earmarks of a professional hit, and since the Millses were high-profile figures with no shortage of potential enemies, I can see someone else committing this crime. All I know is that the story of Jim Jones, the People's Temple, and the Jonestown Massacre has become so iconic and larger than life that this tragic epilogue to the story has become somewhat overlooked. Was Jonestown actually a factor in these murders, or is it nothing more than a red herring? Whatever the case, if you happen to have any information on the unsolved murders of Al, Jeannie, and Daphene Mills, please contact the Berkeley Police Department at 510-981-5900. That's 510-981-5900. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we produced an episode about the very first Final Appeal segment ever produced by Unsolved Mysteries, involving the controversial conviction of Glenn Consagra for the double murder of his friends, Freddie Doberly and Mary Lou Holmes. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Rivers Angel, Don O, Orion G, Shannon S, Rachel T, Alyssa Joy N, Pearl C, Heather, and David Q. Thank you all so much for your support. And I want to remind everyone that The Trail Went Cold has partnered up with the streaming service Get Vocal to take part in their True Crime Thursday lineup. So from now on, every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I will be hosting a weekly live stream session at their website in which I chat with you, the listeners, about the featured case on our podcast that week, as well as various true crime topics. If you join our interactive sessions, you can ask me questions or chat with me live. I will be providing a direct link to our channel in the show notes, but for more information about True Crime Thursdays, please visit the website getvocal.com/dashboard/truecrime. That's GETVOKL.com/dashboard/truecrime. I also just wanted to give a shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.